Welcome back, Commercial Pilot Ground School. This video is going to start to dive into more of the systems that you have in the commercial aircraft. So this one's specifically on environmental systems. More specifically, we're going to talk about what it means to be a high altitude and how to get your endorsement and the kind of training that's required to become pilot in command of a high altitude aircraft. Then we'll talk about supplemental oxygen systems and cabin pressurization. I don't think we see this picture again, but your chapter talks about the pulse oximeters. You can get them pretty cheap at your local Walgreens, CVS, any of those stores. And when I fly high altitude, I'll throw one on my finger just in case. I like to have a comfortable feeling about my blood ox levels, and of course, newer watches will do that for you too. But um, uh, they're nice to have. It's something, one other gadget to help keep things on the right track for you. Why do you need to know this stuff? Well, obviously, so you don't make articles in a future video. This one here, unfortunately, I'll skip to the end. The pilot did everything right, and there was still a crash that occurred. So you can read it here. Quick synopsis. This was a doctor that took off in a turbo-normalized Mooney. Of course, now we know what that means. So that Mooney made sea-level horsepower all the way up to altitude. They were cruising along at 25,000 feet in an unpressurized airplane, which is fine as long as you have supplemental oxygen, and it's just fine as long as that supplemental oxygen lets the oxygen go where it's supposed to. Skip to the end, basically what they discovered after the crash, where they found a loose fitting in the oxygen system that was probably there after the bottle was installed or after the last annual inspection on it. And so he didn't, he turned on oxygen, he was using oxygen, he was still wearing the mask when he crashed. But the oxygen unfortunately leaked out inside the cabin, which wasn't pressurized, instead of leaking out into his oronasal rebreather mask, which he was wearing. What could we have done about this? Well, a periodic check of the inline flow indicators would have helped this pilot identify that he was running out of oxygen, but at 25,000 feet, the time of useful consciousness is not all that great, which is why it's good to have, let's say, one of the new watches with the blood ox warning that would vibrate and let you know that you've dropped below a certain level, or at least having this one on your finger that is right in front of you. You see your numbers start to decline, hopefully, before your cognitive recognition skills start to decline behind it. Anyway, this video is not to talk about is not to dive into the physiological effects of high altitude flight, although we can't really talk about high altitude flying and the need for oxygen without covering at least some of it. But what you could do to, again, not be an article in my video up and coming. Information for this video and for this module and chapter comes from, of course, your Guided Flight Discovery chapter. It's on Canvas. And then I also dig a little bit of information from the Mechanics Handbook, which goes into the maintenance and installation and care of these systems, and the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, which is where some of the information from the Jeppesen book came from. And then for those of you that want to pursue high altitude training and endorsements, you probably don't need it for your private, you probably don't need it for your commercial, but eventually once people start paying you to fly, you can start flying higher, you're going to need this endorsement, and this advisory circular goes over all the stuff you have to cover. So we will briefly cover that too. Okay, so of course the idea of this chapter is so we can talk about the oxygen systems and cabin pressurization systems and then demonstrate an understanding of them. So we'll see a lot of schematics. Most of them come from the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, the Advisory Circular, the Airframe and Power Plant Mechanic book, and then of course you have your Jeppesen book that ideally you read before you're watching this video, and if you didn't, maybe you should pause it and go read it right now. Moving on, why do we need oxygen? Well, we want to go high because we go faster, we burn less fuel, it's a smoother ride, it's better view, there's less traffic. And because you can, to be honest with you. I mean, there's so many reasons why you want to fly an airplane higher. Unfortunately, as you go up in altitude, the availability of the air goes down because the air becomes less dense with altitude, and the air is less dense. There's less oxygen in each breath that you breathe, and the differential pressure becomes an issue. Again, I'm trying not to dive into the physiology of it too much. But you see up here at 40,000 feet, the pressure is only 2.72 psi. Down here at sea level, we have about 14.7. Okay, that's your 2992, 15 degrees Celsius, 0% humidity, sea level standard lapse rate. 14.7 psi is the air you're breathing down at sea level on a standard day. As you go up in altitude, there's less air stacked on top of the air that you're breathing, so it doesn't compress as much. So the higher you go, the less air there is in each breath that you breathe. Another chart that gives us tabular chart instead of a graphical chart. Okay, 28,000 feet. It's way down there, obviously. But let's see how quickly it drops off. You lose about an inch of pressure or so for about every 2,000 feet. And it's fairly consistent. Up until about 18,000 feet, the air is approximately 1/2 as dense as it is at sea level. And then the rate changes quite a bit above that. So kind of think of 18,000 feet, that's when we go to Class Alpha airspace. That's when the air is half as dense as it was down at sea level. It's a pretty important altitude to remember. Some other ones we'll talk about, though. Above 12,500 feet, more than 30 minutes, you need to use supplemental oxygen. And you'll see the pressure is already 5 psi less than it was at sea level. That's a third. The air is 1/3 less dense at 12,500 feet, where you technically don't need to have oxygen unless you go above it. So it's better to have oxygen and use it just to be safe. Worst case scenario, have one of those little portable oxygen, snowboarding, high altitude skiing bottles to have with you, but they by no means are a legal replacement for the required supplemental oxygen. Again, why do we need it? Not just so you don't make a future video, but because the regulations say you have to have it. So we have to use supplemental oxygen. And the first part of this video is going to talk about supplemental oxygen systems, not the pressurized cabin. So when we're talking about a cabin pressure altitude, so the altitude inside the cabin, this either means you're flying an unpressurized aircraft up at this altitude, or you're flying a pressurized aircraft at such a high altitude that the cabin pressure had to then start to increase as well too. But cabin pressure altitudes above 12,500 feet up to 14,000, you have to have oxygen if you're there for more than 30 minutes. That's for required crew members. I'm paraphrasing this because it should have been covered in regulations and it should have been covered in your private pilot. And I think I have a summary slide anyway. So you could theoretically fly at 12,500 feet without ever using oxygen. But if you go to 12,501, you got to start the timer. And if you're at 12,501 for up to 30 minutes, you still don't need oxygen, but on the 30-minute mark, you're supposed to put it on. You're skirting the line there. You technically go up to and including 14,000 feet. So yes, you can fly around at 14,000 feet without using supplemental oxygen up to 30 minutes. And then at the 30-minute mark, you'll need to then either put on oxygen or descend below 12,500 feet. I've actually used this crossing over the Rockies before on an unpressurized aircraft, turbo normalized, so it had the climbing performance, but I didn't have oxygen at the time. So I climbed up to 14,000 feet. I was within 3,000 feet of field elevator of the terrain, so I didn't have to comply with cruising altitudes. And I was at 14,000 feet. As I climbed above 12,500 feet, I started my timer for 30 minutes, and I just made sure I descended on the other side of the mountain range before my time expired. Some people might say that's pretty reckless. When I did this, I had the pulse oximeter, and I was watching it, and I did see my blood ox actually drop a few percent when I was up at 14,000 feet. And it was enough to make me want to go get some kind of an oxygen system after that. Since then, I have a portable oxygen system, and I'm going to get more into that in detail later on. And if I start going above 12,500 feet, I start using it. At nighttime, I use it actually even lower, because honestly, I have it, and it's not that expensive to refill, but it's worth every penny. Okay, anyway, let's get back to the rules here. If you're above 14,000 feet, so you're 14,001 feet or higher, you have to use oxygen the entire time. Okay, so I could be at 14,000 feet for up to 30 minutes without using it, but if I climb one more foot, I have to use it, even if I'm there for 1 second. Above 15,000 feet, you have to provide each occupant of the aircraft with supplemental oxygen. Technically, you don't have to use it, but you have to have it provided for them. So here's your summary. Okay, so above 12,500 feet, if you're going to be up there for more than 30 minutes, you have to use it. If you're above 14,000 feet, crew members have to use it the whole time. And if you're above 15,000 feet, the passengers must be provided with oxygen as well. So yes, up to you could fly around at 14,999 feet, and you have to use oxygen, but you don't have to give it to your passengers, and they're going to sleep pretty well. But no, really, you should consider sharing the love. I say unpressurized aircraft, but it's technically cabin pressure altitude. Okay, we'll talk more about differential pressure in a bit. So the four main types of oxygen systems are going to be continuous flow, diluted demand, pressure demand, and pulse demand. If you have an old version of the textbook, they don't even mention pulse demand because it wasn't really a thing then. So if that's the case, go get a new book because you're missing out on good information. Fortunately for you, it's going to be covered somewhat in this video, but again, the videos that I post are to further explain some material, not to cover all material that was in the book. Okay, here's an oxygen system regulator that you might see in a very high performance or a military aircraft. Obviously, supply on or off. They actually looks like they can adjust the oxygen percentage from normal to 100%, and this one actually has a test or a normal or a emergency setting. This is a pressure demand system that's capable of providing sufficient oxygen above 40,000 feet. You click it to emergency, you click it to 100% oxygen, and it's going to force 100%, well, 99.5% pure oxygen into your body. And like you have to breathe against it to exhale. You probably won't fly one of these. The only time you're either going to be in the military or going through like a military aircrew training or something like that, most likely when you see something like that. So let's talk about the systems you're more likely to see. And this is what I have that I have in my garage that I take with me when I go places. Continuous flow system. These are effective up to 25,000 feet. And this is what was installed in the Mooney that we talked about at the beginning of this video. And that's probably why I stopped at 25,000 feet. You see this in a lot of reciprocating aircraft because most, not all, but a lot of turbine aircraft are then going to be pressurized. And they might have, especially if it's a turbine, it has to bleed air and some other systems to it. There's three main types of continuous flow system. A constant flow. Okay, so a continuous flow is not necessarily the same as constant flow because constant flow is one subcategory of continuous flow. In a constant flow system, think just you have an oxygen bottle and you crack the valve open a little bit. No matter what altitude you're at, it's always letting the same amount of oxygen out. And that basically means that you lose a lot of oxygen at low altitude because you don't need that much more, but it's still putting out that much. A great upgrade to that would be an adjustable flow, and that is what I have. Depending on my altitude, I just turn a knob on the regulator, and it gives me more oxygen output at different altitudes. It's not like I'm cracking open the valve just a little bit more for more oxygen. There's actually a setting on liters per minute that it outputs according to different altitudes and which mask I'm using. And then you've got the third type is the altitude compensated, where it automatically adjusts for altitude for you. So as you go up in altitude, it senses the decreased air pressure and it releases more oxygen. But on these, the oxygen is flowing no matter what. Whether you're inhaling or exhaling, the oxygen is flowing through the mask. That's why it's called a continuous flow. Here's how you get the oxygen from a continuous flow system. The two delivery methods are going to be the nasal cannula. We'll look at this one for a second. So this part goes in your nose. You'll see some pictures later on. This part is the inline flow indicator that hooks up to there. This will turn green when oxygen is flowing and red when it's not. One of the things that pilot could have done in the Mooney to see that oxygen was cut off. But again, at 25,000 feet, he didn't have a whole lot of time to figure that out. And this part goes in the bottle itself. So with these, you kind of need to mantra focus. Breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth and wax on, wax off. When you do that, you're getting most of the oxygen from the cannula system. This only works up to about 18,000 feet or flight level 180. Above that, you need to use a continuous flow mask. So the cannula is good up to 18,000 feet. The continuous flow mask will get you all the way up to 25,000 feet. It doesn't mean you can't use this below 25,000 feet. It's just kind of a pain. More expensive ones will have a microphone built into it. Most of the ones don't. The ones I personally have do not. So I hold on to these guys up to 18,000 feet. As long as I breathe in through my nose and out through my mouth, I'm fine. But once I go above 18,000 feet, this guy's required. And so it's an oronasal rebreather mask. So as you exhale, the oxygen then goes into the bag and it gets diluted with your exhaled air. Then you breathe in the oxygen on the next one. Think of when you're on a commercial airline and they say, although the bag may not inflate, oxygen will be flowing. It depends on the differential pressure outside the bag on whether the bag will inflate or not. So depending if you're high or low altitude, the bag may or may not inflate. So the bag inflating is by no indication means that there's oxygen flowing into it or that you're breathing out. It all has to do with the inline flow indicator to see if oxygen's flowing into it. All right. Out of a different resource, so this one has adjustable flow. So you would actually turn the valve and it would adjust it for liters per minute. So in this system here, the bottle only has an on-off valve, and then you would adjust your flow on the inline flow regulator for that individual cannula. A couple good things about this is you could actually have greater flow for the pilot because, I mean, not to call dibs, but they probably need more oxygen than the passengers riding along in the back. And then, so the way my system specifically works, I have a regulator on the bottle that divvies up. It will deliver from 1 to 4 masks the proper amount of oxygen, and it's adjustable for altitude. And there's your oronasal rebreather face mask. This is very similar to the one that I have. So they can be kind of a pain because ATC has a harder time hearing you because you're got the microphone on the outside of the mask and you're breathing inside of it. So a little bit of practice works with it. I wouldn't say stick the microphone inside the mask because then you're losing a lot of oxygen outside of it that you need. So find out a way to work, or at least be louder. It's not uncommon to hear piston aircraft up at high altitudes sound different on the radio because they're talking through a mask. Okay, that flow indicator. So this specifically is like the one that I have. This indicates no flow, and as soon as oxygen flows through, this little red disc locks out of the way and you see the green portion of it. So on this one, the little green band is right here and it would slip into the window when there's oxygen flowing. Something that simple. I mean, I have it so it's within sight of me. So it's my occasional cruise checks when I'm looking at engine instruments and settings and navigational instruments. I keep my flow indicator in my scan so I can see if it starts to drop off or on me. And then some other ones. You've probably seen ones like this in the hospital. You might actually have, for a built-in oxygen system, you might see an oxygen flow indicator. And it's just a very tiny spring and a valve. And as soon as oxygen flows through it, it just locks it open. You see the flow indicator. Here's what this brand of nasal cannula looks like. So this is looks like probably a Cirrus SR22. They're up at high altitude, obviously using their continuous flow. It's all personal preference. It's a brand. They don't all have to look like that. Here's me using one that looks like more like hospital grades. We're up at around, I don't know, 18,000 feet or so doing this. Probably more like 15 or 16,000 feet. And then, yeah, so whatever works. Okay, again, this was me up at, I want to say 19 or 20. I was trying to climb above some of the weather. You can see the clouds and the reflection of my glasses there. So I'm up there and I've got my pulse oximeter on, and I just keep it on pretty much the whole time. I have it on my yoke hand, so it's kind of always pointed at me. See, the bag does not look like it's inflating at all, but I am. It's working. Trust me, I checked the flow indicator and I'm here, so I made it. Okay, so as we move on from continuous flow, let's look at, so here's the rebreather mask that we were talking about before. So it has the rebreather bag onto it. This is for a continuous flow system. So oxygen's always flowing in through this line and it fills the bag and it dilutes it as you breathe it in. Which is going to be different from the QuickDon system here. You notice there's no rebreather mask, and this looks much more like a scuba equipment, something you might see in a fighter aircraft. And these heavy spring-loaded harness here keeps it onto your mask and makes a really tight seal. You're going to need that for pretty much the next two types of systems we're talking about. So with the diluter demand, it has a regulator, a lot like a scuba regulator, where you breathe in and then it gives you air, but then you stop breathing in and it stops wasting it. Above 28,000 feet, it's 100% oxygen. So it dilutes the oxygen you get and mixes it with ambient air up to 28,000 feet. So below that, it's actually diluting the oxygen so it doesn't waste it. Above 28,000 feet, however, it's 100% pure oxygen that you're breathing in. It gets a nice tight feel. And this works up to 40,000 feet if you have the QuickDon diluter demand mask. So the rebreather mask only works up to 25,000 feet, but the tight seal here on the diluter demand works up to 40,000 feet. With these QuickDonning types, again, you notice there's no rebreather, a nice tight seal, and by QuickDon, I mean within 5 seconds you can yank this thing over your head and it'll start doing its job. Pressure demand, okay, again, here's our pressure demand system we looked at. If you're going to fly above 40,000 feet, uh, you're going to need a pressure demand system. Without getting too much into the weeds, really what happens is the pressure is so low up at 40,000 feet that even if you breathe 100% oxygen, there's not enough oxygen molecules in that breath to give you enough oxygen. So above 40,000 feet, you get pressure. You get air forced into your lungs. It increases the pressure inside your lungs. So you get 100% oxygen that's forced into you, and you have to like exhale against it. It's kind of pretty crazy. It's still got a regulator, so you breathe in and air just shoots. You don't have to breathe it in. You just start to breathe in, and then oxygen just shoots into your lungs. And they take a little bit of practice. You might be thinking, well, why would you fly up at 40,000 feet in an unpressurized aircraft? Well, because you're flying aircraft like this. Because the aircraft you're flying may not be pressurized. You're at cabin pressure altitudes of 40,000 feet, and the aircraft is up there 40,000 feet. So probably not a worry in your 172 yet. Okay, pulse demand is again not covered in the old version of the textbook, and here's just a little bit about it. Used mostly in like home built and sport aircraft for a long time. But what it does is it meters the amount of oxygen you get with each breath, so it releases it over time. I'd equate this to you've seen people with the little walk around oxygen containers that they have, like a little suitcase or a little satchel, and it just every now and then you hear it click and pop out a breath of oxygen. That's how these work. The idea of these is you don't waste as much oxygen because the pulses come less frequently at low altitude, more frequently at high altitude. But yeah, there you go. That's what they look like. So quick summary of our supplemental oxygen systems then. So up to 18,000 feet, you can use a cannula in a continuous flow system. Up to 25,000 feet, you can use a rebreather mask in a continuous flow system. Up to 40,000 feet, diluter demand works okay, as long as you have the quick Dawn mask here with a nice tight seal. It's 100% oxygen above 28,000 feet, and then above 40,000 feet, no matter what, you need a pressure demand. These are the limits for it. It doesn't mean that as you climb, you go from a cannula to a rebreather to a diluter to a pressure demand. If you know you're going above 40,000 feet, you'd start out with a pressure demand system, obviously. Okay, now where's this oxygen come from? From a green bottle normally that says aviators, breathers, oxygen on it. It's very important that you use ABO, that you don't not use hospital or medical grade oxygen. Aviators breathing oxygen is 99.5% pure oxygen. There's a lot less moisture in ABO. It is drier air. It will dry you out. And they don't mix in moisture like they do with hospital grade oxygen. You're probably going to get dry sinuses and throats from using these for an extended period because it is such dry air coming in. So you can't just go down to your local hospital, or you can't just go to your local scuba because they're compressed air. They're not compressed oxygen. Except for you deep sea divers out there, and then that's a whole new world. Get it? All right. Where do you get these from? Well, so in the AFD, in the Airport Facilities Directory, you can actually see under servicing when they say OX 1, 2, 3, 4, or just one or the other. That's the different types of oxygen. Aviators, breathers, oxygen, liquid oxygen. Sometimes they can fill them installed in the aircraft. Sometimes you have to pull them out and bring them into the shop and install them. Me personally, I go to the local FBO where I do a lot of my flying and flight training. I'll drop off the bottle. They bring it over to the maintenance shop. The maintainers will reservice it, and they measure the amount that they put into it, and I pay per liter, I think is what it is, as they refill it. You have to know what you're doing to mess with these things, so please don't go do it on your own. All right. High heat makes air expand. Increased pressure, thanks to Boyle's law, increases pressure, which increases heat. So, but it's not just that. There's a huge fire hazard with these. That 100% oxygen comes into contact with grease or oil or fluids. Like if you don't oil the threads on these bottles when you screw them back together again, because bad things can happen. If you want more information about pilot safety equipment, you can either type in this link, or I will try to include it in the comment or in the notes below. And you can learn a little bit more from the FAA about the different oxygen systems. Okay, how do you use these systems? I told you a little bit about my experiences. Personally, what I have is I have the Skyhawk system. It's the 12-15. It's a 15 cubic foot aluminum cylinder. Um, Maximum duration with the Oximizer, this guy right here, would be up to 14 hours if one person is using it. At 15,000 feet using the mask, it's only 4, and that's again for one person. A lot of times I go someplace with 2, and that would means I only have like 2 hours and 15 minutes if I have 15,000 feet. And so it would work to get me somewhere, and then I'd have to refill it before I come on the way back. I don't use it on every flight, but I got the bigger system here because I wanted to be able to have more oxygen than just I need. The only downside to any of it is it costs money, of course, but it's worth every penny in my opinion, and it does cost you 11 pounds of weight. So make sure you put it in with your weight and balance. Make sure it's secured tightly. Mine goes on the back of the seat I'm not sitting in. That way I can reach over and check it and adjust it and do so. But don't put it behind your own seat because you can't get to it. This is off the Oximizer cannula chart, okay, on how many liters per minute it uses. And then it's saying that they say at 18,000 feet, 0.6 liters a minute is fine, but the FAA says when you put a mask on, 1.8 liters. So going from cannula to mask actually triples your oxygen consumption, and that's where you see the big decrease in the Oximizer to the mask right there. But I would, it depends on you. It depends what your blood ox is before you take off. It depends on your fitness, if you're a smoker or not. And the length of time that you're at altitude. So use that some kind of a pulse ox reader and kind of get a feel for you. When in doubt, use more oxygen than less, even if it means you have to stop and refill that bottle. Better safe than sorry. Okay, one of the other ways of oxygen we didn't talk about, you get oxygen from an aviator's breather's oxygen servicing center, or these chemical oxygen generators. I've seen these in pressurized 210s, and you have seen these on pretty much every commercial flight that you've taken, even though you haven't seen them. They're usually used for emergency use. So in a pressurized aircraft, this is where your backup oxygen a lot of time comes from. If you remember, Part 91 regulations require, 91-211 requires a 10-minute supply of oxygen for each passenger when you're above 25,000 feet. That 10 minutes allows for you to descend down below the 15,000 feet that's required for you to provide it for them. And here's, you're starting to see where they might be at. So let's say this door pops open, all these 3 masks pop down. When you pull on the cord, what you're doing is you're firing the pin that gets everything going inside the chemical oxygen generator. And through a chemical reaction process, it creates oxygen. And then you get about 15 or 22 minutes on each bottle of oxygen, so more than the 10 basically. So yeah, there's a little science and chemistry behind it. So again, when you pull on the mask, okay, it doesn't mean pull it out of the ceiling, just so we're clear. But when you pull on the mask, it pulls the pin out, and then it begins this process. And there you go. There's your chemical oxygen generator. Go ahead and read more about that in your chart if you want to. One other question you might see, it's green breathing oxygen tape that identifies oxygen tubing. So if you ever see a line you don't know what it is, look for the stickers that are on it. If there's no sticker, then look for somebody who knows what it's supposed to be. This is really important because you obviously don't want to let oil go through a line that's going to then have oxygen in it. And there they are in commercial aircraft. This is a service unit that was unhinged there, so I don't think this was one of the automatic deployment units. But so when this pops down in the flight, you gently pull on it, and that starts the flow of oxygen. Make sure you put on your mask before you help anybody else around you. Why? Because of tuck, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So let's move on from small aircraft, probably piston powered, unpressurized aircraft, or maybe high altitude and pressurized aircraft. But let's go from supplemental oxygen to what if we go without oxygen? How can I not have to fly around at altitude with a mask on? Most of you know that you fly around your commercial aircraft between 30 and 40,000 feet, and most of you have not ever put on an oxygen mask. You did that because they pressurized the cabin of the aircraft, so you were still down at like 8,000 feet, even though the aircraft was up at 35,000 feet. So kind of a quick overview on cabin pressure. pressurization. So if you have a turbine aircraft, that's probably where your cabin pressure comes from. It comes from bleed air. It's not from hot turbine exhaust. Okay, it's from that air that was compressed prior to being introduced with fuel and then combustion process. So this is compressed natural ambient air that then got bled off of the engine and filled up the cabin. You'll see a couple pretty important parts on other charts, but basically air comes in from the bleed air, air goes out through the outflow valve. And I like this because, especially in today's age of we want cleaner air, you get to see where air comes in and out of a lot of these aircraft. So air gets pretty much put in on each one of them, and you see where all the air comes out is on the outflow valve back here. And there is a filter, obviously, that mixes everything together. So there's a little bit of any air that is recycled goes through a HEPA filter, but then all the air basically gets bled out of the tail of the aircraft eventually. Okay, so 91-11 here. Let's look. A was supplemental oxygen. B, let's talk about pressurized cabin aircraft. If you're above flight level 250, you have to have at least a 10-minute supply of oxygen for each occupant. We already talked about that. Oftentimes it's chemical oxygen generators. We keep going though. If you're above 350, at least one pilot of the controls has to be wearing an oxygen mask. That either so it has to be on. So above 35,000 feet, if you're in a single piloted aircraft, you have to sit there with your mask on. And either the oxygen has to be flowing, or it has to automatically start flowing when your cabin pressure altitude goes above 14,000 feet. So you'll learn about the system you're flying with, obviously. So if you're flying along above 35,000 feet and you're by yourself in the cockpit, you have to have the mask on, and either has to be flowing or automatically will start flowing. If there's two of you in the cockpit, one of you has to have the mask on. If you're above 41,000 feet. So, if you're below 41, so up to 41,000 feet, if there's two pilots in the aircraft, neither one has to wear a mask if they both have a quick donning mask they can put on with one hand within 5 seconds. It's something you'll need train for, obviously. So above 25,000 feet, a 10-minute supply for every occupant. Above 35,000 feet, you either need to wear a mask or have two pilots in the cockpit with a quick donning mask. Above 41,000 feet, that goes away. So above 41,000 feet, at least one pilot has to be wearing it. We go back to the 35,000 feet here because they say it's the way the regulation is written. Except that while below flight level 41,000 or flight level 410, neither one has to wear one if there are two pilots. Well, it's a long flight if you're at 41,000 feet, right? So, and this is in a pressurized aircraft. Inside, it's still only 6,000 or 8,000 feet, but the aircraft itself is up at 41,000 feet. What if somebody has to get up and go to the bathroom? Well, there's actually a regulation saying specifically for that. If for any reason one pilot has to leave, the other one has to put on the mask and use it. Not just have it on and have it automatically go, but have it on and use it. So up to 35,000 feet, you either have to have a mask on and you either flowing or it'll automatically start flowing, or two pilots in the cockpit. And then if there's ever one pilot in the cockpit above 35,000 feet, they have to have the mask on. Up to 41,000 feet, neither pilot has to wear one if there's two and they can both have a mask. It's the legal way it's written that makes it a little tough, but hopefully that helped a little bit. And then, of course, we get into a whole bunch more regulations on this one. Now, if we're saying no person may act as pilot in command of a pressurized aircraft unless they've received and logged ground training from an authorized instructor in a pressurized aircraft or in a simulator, and then you've covered all this stuff. So it's actually really hard to get this endorsement because you have to have the training in a pressurized aircraft. And believe it or not, people generally don't want you to take their pressurized aircraft and do emergency descents and all kinds of training in it. And your passengers generally don't like it either. And this is what the training includes. I'm not giving you the endorsement through this training because we're not doing the training in a flight simulator indicative of one that can fly over 25,000 feet, and we're not doing it in an aircraft. So here's the stuff that you're going to read up on before you go to get your training. Okay, so how to get that high altitude endorsement, just a little bit more about it. Again, I'm not giving you the endorsement here, just giving you the tools to learn what you need to know. Here's what you're going to have to cover with your ground instructor. High altitude aerodynamics and meteorology, respiration, and then let's see, you have to talk about your 4 types of hypoxia and other high altitude sicknesses. Time of useful consciousness without supplemental oxygen, what happens when you use it for a really long time. We talk about trapped gas and decompression sickness, all kinds of stuff that you don't want to have to deal with, right? Let's briefly discuss all the extra knowledge that you can get from Advisory Circular 61.107b, which discusses high altitude operations, specifically the training to get it. This is stuff that you should incorporate into all training courses if you fly above 25,000 feet. And really, I cut it off here because ground training, they get really in depth on it. And this is a good resource for all the training you're going to need. A lot of the other stuff we just talked about. Briefly on the physiology training, that's why I have it highlighted there. We'll come back to that actually. There we go. We'll get to the physiology training in just a second. Here's the stuff you have to do in the air. So ground training is everything that we just had listed there. Flight training will include a pre-flight, briefing planning, talking about the high altitude stuff, how to pre-flight the oxygen system, make sure there's no loose fittings, and how to operate it. Now, all the procedures through climb, and then all your emergencies, your planned descents and emergency descents, and then everything else. So let's get into kind of what they discuss. Here's parts of physiology they cover. They cover hypoxia, not just the 4 types of hypoxia, but it gets more in depth into the partial pressure at altitudes. And this isn't a human factors class. We've already touched on some of it previously in this semester, but this advisory circular will cover it just a little more in depth. They also talk about hyperventilation, lack of CO2, trapped gas, and the problems you can get from that in both an climb and descent, and decompression sickness, why you don't scuba dive and then fly, or why you don't scuba dive and then even fly in a pressurized aircraft, because what if the pressurization system fails? And then they get into time of useful consciousness. And this ties it back to our opening story. Why did the pilot of the Mooney not realize that something was wrong? Well, because your time of useful consciousness goes down with altitude. So AC 61.107b defines time of useful consciousness, or TUC. The period, how long it takes from either your loss of oxygen or your loss of cabin pressure to the time when you are no longer capable of taking proper corrective and protective action. And they get a lot more in depth into this one. Like, this is not definitive. Okay, this is 3 to 5 minutes and you're no good anymore. 1 minute into this, you start to lose your cognitive ability. One of the first symptoms of hypoxia is euphoria, or is the feeling that everything is going right. So one of the first symptoms of you losing cabin pressure or supplemental oxygen is that you start to think that nothing's wrong. You see down here, you start getting hypoxia symptoms at 10,000 feet. So if you're going to fly above 10,000 feet for any period of time, you should consider using oxygen. This is why they sell those little oxygen bottles when you're at ski resorts, and because they're up at such high altitude. And it goes down from there. You're looking at above 30,000, 35,000 feet, you had about 30 seconds worth of useful consciousness. 30 seconds from knowing that something's wrong until you're basically too, stupid, really, to do anything about it. We pressurize the aircraft for more comfort, convenience, and so we don't have to worry about all those aeromedical factors. But how do we do it? Well, that extra air comes from the turbocharger, which we learned about in high-performance power plants. If you're in a piston airplane, it probably comes from a turbo or from a supercharger. And you see here, the air is coming in, goes through the turbo, or then in this example, a supercharger. Some air goes out to the engine, more air for more power, for more altitude. Some of that compressed air goes into the cabin, where you are, for more pressure. And again, if it's a turbine aircraft, turbo shaft, prop, or jet, it's probably going to come from compressor bleed air. And that's just a side view of a turbocharger. This is talking about superchargers, talking about turbochargers, same idea. And again, from turbine, this is turboprops. It might also use a compressor turbine, or it might just use bleed air in a jet pump. That's just another way of accelerating through the venturi, which will obviously increase the velocity. And either way, the overview of the cabin pressurization system here is going to be your bleed air and a turboprop, or the compressed air from the turbocharger or supercharger, is going to go through some kind of ducting into the pressure vessel. This is where you are, usually kind of a fore and aft bulkhead or some kind of a strengthened structural component that you're sitting in. And then the outflow valve is going to be what controls ultimately the pressure inside the vessel, because it opens up to let more air out to lower the pressure, or it closes to keep more air in to increase the pressure. So we need to talk about a few more terms with pressurization first. So first, let's talk about cabin pressure altitude, or that's the equivalent altitude inside the cabin. That's when you're flying in your commercial aircraft at 35,000 feet, your pressure of the air that you're breathing is not at 35,000 feet, because you'd all be fast asleep if it was. So that's the equivalent of what it would be outside is what it actually is inside. The structural strength of the aircraft limits how much differential you could do. So the space shuttle is built to be a little bit stronger, and it can go up to much lower pressure than your commercial aircraft can, for instance. And cabin differential pressure, that's the difference between what the pressure is inside the aircraft and what the pressure is outside the aircraft. We call that PSID, or pounds per square inch differential. And just for a few points, most large transport aircraft, your Boeing and your Airbus, can handle about 9 PSID, and that's their limit. Anything above that, and you can start to have structural damage occur. Except for like the 787, it can actually go higher PSID than that, and I just showed it a little differently here. So normally when your 787 is cruising around in the high 30s and the 40s of thousands of feet, inside the cabin you're only at 6,000 feet, so it has a higher PSID than other aircraft. It's a composite construction, and it had comfort in mind when they built it. So you finish a long flight in a 787, and you're often will feel more rested than if you flew something else, because the whole time you were at a lower altitude. And just for reference, like say P210s and a lot of smaller GA aircraft could only handle about 3.5 to 4.5 PSID. To get more than that, you'd have to strengthen the fuselage more, which takes weight, which takes away from performance, and it's kind of a vicious cycle. So to put it all in perspective, what this picture is showing us that inside both these aircraft, the inside cabin altitude is at 8,000 feet. Inside of here, the cabin differential, or the cabin pressure altitude, is 8,000 feet. Cabin pressure altitude is 8,000 feet. So whether the airplane's flying at 40,000 feet or whether the airplane's flying at 24,000 feet, you inside of it are only at 8,000 feet for all intents and purposes. The difference here, what this is showing, is outside. Down here at sea level, it's 14.7 psi. At 24,000 feet, it's 5.7. At 40,000 feet, it's only 2.7 psi. The pressure decreases with altitude. We've already talked about that. Let's go over here to the PSID, however. Inside cabin altitude, 8,000 feet altitude is 10.9 psi. But down here, with the ambient pressure of 10.7 minus the cabin pressure, the cabin pressure minus the ambient pressure, and yes, it's 10.9 or 10.7. Right here's a typo, that should be 10.92. So 10.92 minus the 5.7, which it is actually outside, and the difference in pressure between the inside and outside the airplane down here at 24,000 feet is 5.2 PSID. And that's comfortable within that max range. Now, however, look at the same aircraft up here at 40,000 feet. Ambient air pressure is only 2.7. Inside, it's still 10.9. We don't have a typo here. And so the difference between those two is 8.2. So there's an 8 pounds per square inch difference between the inside of the aircraft and the outside of the aircraft. Remember, most transport category aircraft are limited to about 9 PSID. And this is why one of the things that limits how high you can go in a commercial aircraft. The same aircraft without passengers in the military could go a whole lot higher, and all the crew members would start wearing pressure demand oxygen systems. But that's one of the things that limit how high you can go in these commercial aircraft. Okay, some more pressurization terms and a good overview of the system. I used to have schematic of the P210 that I keep talking about up in here, but it's a little more out of date, and the FAA updated this one, so we're using this one. So compressor, wherever the air comes from, either the bleed air discharge, the turbo, or the supercharger, that's where the air comes from. Okay, that's what we're showing here. And then there's going to be some kind of a heat exchanger, and that's another way of saying an air cooler. So when you compress air, Boyle's law says it heats up, and you don't want 100 or 200 degree Fahrenheit compressed air coming into your cabin because it wouldn't be very comfortable for you. So you have to cool that air down. It heated up when you compressed it. You need to cool it before it goes into the cabin. That's what the heat exchanger does. The outflow valve is normally back here somewhere in the back of the aircraft. So what the outflow valve does, it opens up to allow more air to escape. It closes to keep more air in the cabin. So the way this works is you don't limit how much air comes in to pressurize the cabin. You limit how much air you keep in, or you vary the valve to let more air escape. That helps with circulation of the engine, of the airflow. A little more comfortable in there. Maybe it doesn't smell quite as much. So it's a key component of this system is the outflow valve that opens to let more air escape to lower the pressure, or it closes to keep more air in to raise the pressure. A separate component is the dump valve, or the safety valve. So this is the safety valves, and if you overpressurize the cabin, this will open up to keep you from popping like a balloon. So if you exceed that GA aircraft 4.5 PSID or the transport category 9 PSID, the safety valve will open automatically and let that extra air go. It's also a dump valve, and it's in the 210 anyway. It's just a knob you pull, and it just vents all this air outside the cabin immediately. You would do that if in a danger of overpressurization, or if the outflow valve broke in the closed position, then you would use that. And the next two are these instruments we'll see on the next page. So let's just look at them. Your indicator seen here shows us two different things. This one shows us the cabin pressure altitude on the outside here, and then it shows us the differential pressure on the inside. So this is PSID on the inside, and this is feet of altitude on the outside. This aircraft that we're looking at right here looks like it's up around 5,700 or so feet of altitude, and the cabin is currently not pressurized. So it's at 0 psi difference between the inside and the outside, and the inside is at 5,800, so that tells me the aircraft's probably at 5,800. There's a couple ways of operating these cabin pressure systems, either in the isobaric range or in the differential range. In the isobaric range, it maintains cabin altitude. So you say, I want you to maintain a cabin altitude of 5,000. And then no matter what altitude the airplane goes to, the inside's at 5,000. And let's see what kind of air. This is probably a GA aircraft, because you see the PSID max is at around 4.7 or something like that. And then any greater than that, up here somewhere, the safety valve is probably going to pop open and start letting air out. Okay, the differential range is when you operate here at the max differential. So the way I see a lot of systems work is the inside of the aircraft will stay at sea level. So as you take off and as you climb in the aircraft, you don't climb inside the cabin. So the cabin will be at sea level while the aircraft climbs up to 5, 10, whatever thousand feet. What it'll do is it'll slowly start to pressurize the aircraft, and it'll keep you as low as altitude as it can, right up until it hits its differential. And then after that point, you'd be operating in the differential range. And as the aircraft continues to climb, then the cabin altitude would start to increase as well too. So I see a lot of these aircraft, they operate in isobaric range up until the max PSID, and above that altitude it operates in the differential range. And then there's also, in more complex systems, you can control the cabin rate of climb. You don't see these as much in piston aircraft because the aircraft itself can't climb or descend. Well, it can't climb all that quickly, so you don't have to then comfort it for the passengers as much. But in larger aircraft that are capable of a steeper climb and therefore more rapid descent, they would actually control the rate of climb and descent inside. So here's out of a Beechcraft, obviously. They have a pretty 5 differential. This one's way in the red right there, so this one's been over pressurized. So something needs fixed on this one right now. So inside the cabin, it's at 10,000 feet, and the PSID is like almost 5.5. So this aircraft that we're looking at is probably up around 18, 24,000 feet because it's maxed out on cabin differential, and inside the cabin, it's at 10,000 feet. And then you may or may not see a rate of climb controller here showing you how quickly the pressure inside the cabin is changing. And this is showing us all the same stuff we just looked at, but this one tells us what all the arms mean. So here's our PSID max, here's our cabin pressure altitude indicator, and here's our PSID indicator. Again, this is in thousands of feet, and the inner scale is in PSID. What we didn't talk about was a negative pressure relief valve. It's a little spring-loaded valve somewhere in the aircraft, but it's designed to keep the cabin altitude from being higher than airplane altitude. In other words, it's designed to keep you from having more pressure on the outside than on the inside. Airplanes are built to withstand extra pressure inside because they're built to fly in high altitude. They're not designed to have more pressure on the outside. They're not a submarine, which are built to have more pressure pushing in from the outside. These aircraft are designed, usually to open around 1.5 to 1 PSID. In other words, if pressure outside the aircraft is greater than the inside, these open up automatically. That'd be a problem when you land in the water because then the valves would open up and fill up the cabin with water because they're trying to equalize the pressure. That's why you're not supposed to spray fluids into here because they spring load open. Now, what if you want to ditch in the water? Well, there's actually in the Airbus at least there's a ditching button for that, which closes the outflow valve, so it doesn't fill back up with water. Somebody thought of everything. Okay, we're going to talk about systems. We're going to talk about what can go wrong with the systems. Well, cabin decompression is something that can always happen. So we break them into a few categories. Gradual decompression, it happens over at least 10 seconds or more. It slowly leaks out when you slowly lose pressure. A rapid decompression happens somewhere between 1 and 10 seconds. It happens very quickly, enough to where your ears might not have a chance to pop. You're going to feel the change much more dramatically. And then the worst case is an explosive decompression. Basically, the determining factor between explosive and rapid is the air leaving your lungs goes faster than you can exhale. That'd be in an explosive decompression. So in an explosive decompression, you might actually have physiological problems from it. Eardrums might blow out. You might get some lung damage, none of which you want to happen, obviously. And when it happens, if you've ever seen videos of it or read some news reports, there's reports of smoke in the cabin and then loud noises. Well, I'm not saying it wasn't smoke, but if it's from decompression, it's not smoke. What it is fog. As everybody breathing out inside the cabin had increased the moisture content inside there so much that when that cabin air pressure then decreased rapidly because it decompressed explosively or rapidly, all that air lost pressure so quickly that all that moisture then became visible moisture. So it turns into a big cloud. Either way, if it's a smoke or fog, it doesn't really matter to you because your first step is to don oxygen masks. If it's smoke, you don't want to breathe the smoke. If it's hypoxia from rapid decompression, you need oxygen. So your number one step in an emergency descent when you have smoke or oxygen or decompression problems is to don your oxygen mask. And then, of course, to initiate your emergency descent. Step 1, always don the oxygen mask. Make sure you put on yours before you help those around you. And step 2 would be to initiate the emergency descent. It's very important you do that over. Just a few snippets from the same advisory circular. They talk about slow decompression is as bad or worse than rapid or explosive decompression. And you might think, well, why? It gives you more time to react if it's a slow decompression. And I'm kind of letting you think for yourself right now. Why a slow decompression would be worse? And you're all shouting it at the screen, so I'll move on. It's because you won't know what's happening. So a slow decompression might happen so slowly that you don't realize you're losing cabin pressure. And that's actually led to a couple other accidents or close accidents that have occurred. And if it's rapid or explosive, you know what happened. It's hard to ignore that fact, and you know you need to put on oxygen. So Then the other warning is time of useful consciousness does not mean the onset of unconsciousness. They say impaired performance may be immediate, and that is huge. That's something that we need to pay attention to. Within 1 second of you losing cabin pressurization, you start to lose your ability to. You're not all that you can be any longer. So first thing you always do in any decompression or oxygen deprivation is to get oxygen flowing into your body as quickly as possible. Okay, so back in 1988, the roof flew off a Hawaiian Airlines flight, and this was an explosive decompression, and it was bad enough that it took part of the roof with it. Yes, one crew member was subsequently sucked out of the aircraft, but miraculously enough, the airplane came back and landed. And there was some physiological problems to the passengers from the rapid or from the explosive decompression, but hey, everybody kept their act together. The pilots donned their oxygen masks. They initiated an emergency descent. The oxygen masks for those passengers who still had an overhead compartment dropped down, and then they got the oxygen. Everybody sitting in this component got an awesome view of the islands during their emergency descent, but they didn't have any oxygen mask to breathe on the way down. But we always train for stuff like this, all right? That's why we have 2 pilots and quick donning masks, and that's why we have supplemental oxygen for the passengers, because stuff like this can still happen. Of course, we learned a lot of lessons from this accident on cycles of aircraft, not just hours, but the pressurization, depressurization cycles is what led to metal fatigue for this aircraft. But it's something you might want to cover in your human factors class. Okay, so let's do a brief summary here. We got unpressurized aircraft and pressurized aircraft. For unpressurized aircraft, you actually don't have to have an endorsement. Remember, the endorsement's only required to be PIC of an aircraft that's capable of pressurized flight higher than 25,000 feet. So if you fly pressurized aircraft, but it's limited at 24,000, you don't need the high altitude endorsement to fly it. The 210 is a good example of that. It's pressurized. You're flying along in the flight levels at 20-some thousands of feet, but you don't have to have the endorsement for it. You only need the endorsement if it can go over 25,000. So basically, if it's not pressurized, let's get back to that. If it's not pressurized, you need to use supplemental oxygen as a crew member if you're over 12.5 for more than 30 minutes, up to and including 14,000. Above 14,000, the crew has to use it the whole time, and above 15,000, you have to provide it for passengers. And then oxygen is recommended at night as low as 5,000 feet because of the degradation in vision that occurs. And then anytime you're over 10,000 feet, especially if you're there for a long time, the hypoxic effects become cumulative. So you might want to consider using it if you have it. Step 1 is having it. Step 2 is using it. Versus pressurized aircraft. So quick summary of rules for pressurized aircraft. Above flight level 250 or above 25,000 feet, you have to have a 10-minute supply for each occupant. And then you have to have that 6131G high altitude PIC endorsement. Above 35,000 feet, at least one pilot has to wear it, unless there's 2 pilots and they both have a quick donning mask. And then above 41,000 feet, it doesn't matter, at least one pilot has to have it on and use it the entire time. Okay, so once again, above 35,000 feet, one pilot must at least have it on and use it, or have it automatically start distributing oxygen above a certain cabin altitude. But above 41,000 feet, one pilot has to have it on and has to be pumping in the whole time. All right, so it was a pretty good summary, I would like to think, of our high altitude stuff. We didn't actually get into the high altitude physiology as much as the advisory circular or your human factors class would, or near enough is what you're going to go into when you get that endorsement from your authorized instructor. But we talked about supplemental oxygen, and we talked about how we pressurize the cabin, some rules to follow, a little about physiology, and then what to do if things go really wrong. Most important thing, put on oxygen first. Okay, I think that's about it. So I want to say thanks for watching. Check Canvas for assignments, and check for part 2 of this week's video, which will be ice control systems. Thanks.